Thank you. Thank you for waiting for our setup here. All right, so today we're going to get into the looming apocalypse, in quotes, about all the Drupal 7 sites that are out there. So who here in the audience is responsible for or working with the Drupal 7 site? So most of you, all of you? Good? Okay. So just to be upfront, I'm not going to get into a 45-minute technical discussion about how you can upgrade your site specifically, but we will touch on what some of the issues are. So, how do I do this? Next. All right, so about me, as she said, I'm with Electric Citizen. We're a web agency out of Minneapolis. We have been working, myself, I've been working on the web for over 20 years, and with Drupal for over 10 years, or I think that's right, yeah. And I am on Twitter, Minneapolis Dan. I am from Minneapolis. I'm also on Drupal.org at Minneapolis Dan. Electric Citizen, as I mentioned, we're based out of Minneapolis. We are a web agency, full service, design, development, strategy, and support, primarily with Drupal. We have a focus in particular on the civic sector, which we define as government, higher ed, nonprofits, arts, science, medicine. We're open source advocates. We're online at electriccitizen.com. Do not go to Electric Citizen, the band. That is something we had nothing to do with. They came after us. And as an agency, we're on Twitter at Electric Citizen. So what we're going to cover today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the current state of Drupal 7. Talk about planning an upgrade if that's in your future. We're going to touch on why it's so hard. If you haven't heard, it is. And then what are the benefits if you do upgrade? And we'll even look at some alternatives to upgrading, because moving from Drupal 7 to 8 may not be for everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. I don't even know where my mic is, somewhere down here. All right. The Drupal 7 coming apocalypse. You may have already heard this, but if not, I'll tell you, Drupal 7 is nearing its end of life. So we're going to explore what that means. Is anyone planning already to do an upgrade to Drupal 8 in the near future, year or two, maybe a few of you? Okay. Anyone already gone through that process on some sites? No? Oh yeah, you have, in the back, yes. All right. How was that for you, Chris?
I mean, honestly, I tell people it's basically like migrating to a different CMS.
Right.
It's not like pushing a button and magically engage. It's really a whole new CMS, so you have to go do it with that mindset.
Right, exactly, yeah. I wish it was easy, but it is not. Also, just touch on this, one of the things that inspired my talk is, this is a sample email that someone sent to one of our clients, triggering a bit of panic for them when they saw the email that their Drupal 7 site will soon be vulnerable to online threats. And that's something that they came to us with, and we're worried, what danger are we in? And we had to explain that, yes, you have to be thinking about this, but you still have several years. But this is sort of for anyone out there, if you're responsible for a site, think of like a coworker, or if you're running an agency and your clients get this kind of message, it can stir a lot of confusion. And for us, it was a wake-up call to say, okay, we have to, not only are we thinking about this and planning it, but we want to be proactive with our clients because they might be getting some panic messages. But the truth is that the end is nigh, that Drupal 7, it was released in 2011. Its end of life is officially set for 2021. Oops. That's my little timeout thing I forgot to turn off. So that means it'll have a full 10 years of life, which in the web world, that's a pretty good run. That's nothing to in my opinion, to feel bad about that suddenly it will no longer be supported. Like, it really has been supported for a long time. And it's powered hundreds of thousands of websites. What we'll see next is it still powers hundreds of thousands of websites. And also just the idea that it's been raised, I think it's a little interesting that some people might consider Drupal 7 to be peak Drupal, the peak of the whole platform. And it definitely was in terms of numbers. Whether we'll return to those numbers in future versions of Drupal, that remains to be seen. But just taking a look here at Drupal 7 usage in today's numbers. So 73% of all Drupal sites out there are still running on Drupal 7, which is a huge number, which sort of lends itself to this idea of the apocalypse. Of course, it's not anything that serious, but it is raise the question, what's going to happen to all those sites and those people who depend on them. These numbers have decreased for D7, short for Drupal 7, and increased for D8, Drupal 8 sites just in the past year from when I saw someone else give a somewhat related talk. So there has been a steady decrease since 2016, but that still leaves us with more Drupal 7 sites active out there than Drupal 8. And when I think about this, my assumption, of course, was, well, there's probably hundreds of thousands of small companies, small mom and pop stores, small sites that are making up the bulk of the numbers. And it's true, but I also was curious, and I did just a quick research of what's considered when you hear people give like, oh, what are the biggest names in Drupal sites out there? And a lot of them are still running Drupal 7, including the brands that you see here. So that was kind of surprising to me. Not entirely, because I know that the cost and effort to do this, to move them to Drupal 8 is significant. But it definitely isn't something that only is a concern for the smaller sites. Also, the concept that, yes, Drupal 7 is still supported through 2021, but some people have raised the question, is it already dead? And by that they mean that the attention and focus has all been on Drupal 8 for quite a while now. So if you're looking for help on an issue in the issue queues for a Drupal 7 site, those are just piling up, and people aren't necessarily resolving or answering your questions anymore because all the attention is on what's coming next, which is Drupal 8 and then soon Drupal 9 next year. So, PHP updates keep coming out that affect Drupal 7 sites. jQuery versions keep upgrading, and so people will apply patches and such to modules that your Drupal 7 site needs. But even before 2021, for some people, this is already reality that it's not really working for them anymore. So knowing all that, what's going to happen when Drupal 7 actually officially stops being supported? Many of you already know this, but it means there won't be any more official security updates, there won't be new features, there won't be module support or bug fixes. So it is a big deal depending on what you need out of your site, but it doesn't mean it necessarily is a panic mode. There's options. So knowing the end is near, how are you going to plan for that site upgrade? So here's what we need to know. One of the first things I like to say when I'm approached by a client that asks what's it going to take to upgrade us from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 is I say, well, how old is your site? When's the last time we redesigned it? And the reason is, well, several reasons. One, just as a general rule of thumb, it's recommended, depending on the size of your organization and your needs, to redesign your site as a whole every 2 to 5 years. 2 years would be maybe sort of a larger, more extremely active site, whereas 5 years could be like a smaller nonprofit site or something. But in general, there are so many things that have changed that you shouldn't necessarily look at it as, well, I'm just going to upgrade the version of my software and be done, because it's time to redesign anyway. And when you consider it that way, even though the version upgrade itself is costly, it makes a little more sense or easier to justify if you're also getting a full redesign out of the site. And some of the reasons, if you're wondering why to redesign, and notice we're getting past some of the apocalyptic images now into some spring crocuses, but a big one for me is changing user expectations. What was the norm when you first built your site even 3 years ago may not be anymore. And so if someone, for example, fills out a form on Facebook or whatever, and it's this experience where they're able to just do it on the page and they get instant feedback, that sort of user experience, you're not getting that out of your Drupal 7 site because of the way it's designed or built. And once the user expectation is that a site should work a certain way, if you're not meeting it, your site starts to disappoint your users or make your brand look old. Other obvious reasons to increase your site traffic, what's working on your site, what's not, how to increase donations or sales, new requirements that come out every day, things that we've faced. You might have a Drupal 7 site, there's plenty out there that aren't responsive, right? Because that wasn't a thing when they built them 8 years ago, or if it wasn't a big concern. So things about performance or accessibility, that's another big one. Something that if you built a site 5 years ago, you probably weren't thinking about. Even privacy, that's a new one, which I'll touch on when I talk about that tomorrow. And then really just keeping up with your competition. What are they doing to attract users and sell things or sell your services? How can you keep that up if you don't update your site? All right, so if you're preparing for redesign, remember to start planning and budgeting early. That's one thing that a lot of organizations and clients don't necessarily consider. They come to you, they have X amount of dollars for a redesign, and they don't consider that 3 years from now they'll have to do the same thing. It doesn't mean they have to, but it's something that if it makes sense for your organization, make sure you're budgeting every year for this instead of being surprised when someone says, that site we built for you 10 years ago is no longer going to be supported, and it's going to cost as much or more as that original site did, because that's sort of just the reality for most people, except for all but the smallest sites. So it's a good time to revisit your site strategy. Consider, have you updated your brand at all? Do you want to test out your users? How are they using the site? Survey them, see what they like and don't like about your current site. It's all part of the process for preparing for that redesign that can happen as part of your upgrade from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. And then one question that occurred to me, I don't know if it's something you've asked yourself, but can you just skip to Drupal 9, right? Because that's something that previously a number of people, when they were on Drupal 6, anyone here using Drupal 6 previously? A couple of you? One of the advices that was given out is, oh, you can just skip straight to Drupal 8. There's no compelling reason to upgrade. But it's not the same with Drupal 9, which comes out next year, and that's due to the way that Drupal has been re-architected and the way versionings work, that Drupal 9 is going to be more of just a continuation of the same software. So it's not completely reinventing Drupal. It'll be more like unofficially Drupal 8.9 instead of a whole new piece of software. And knowing that, if you can upgrade in the next year, you might as well. Like, there's no reason to wait for Drupal 9 to come out because it's not the same as it was before. Does that make sense? You're my favorite audience person. You always get eye
It makes a ton
contact.
of sense.
The rest of you I like. All right, so why aren't people upgrading? There's still 700,000 Drupal 7 sites out there, so why is it? So I listed some reasons I found and from talking to people, see if they resonate with you at all. But number one is cost. If you don't know what it costs, that probably isn't your reason yet, but once you find out, that might be a good reason why you don't want to do it, because you'll find out, oh my gosh, it's not just a 4-hour job. It's, it could be hundreds of hours. It's something we'll explore later in the talk. It might be time. You're so busy with your day-to-day life, or your clients are, that they just don't want to commit the time for it. This third one is something that's interesting. I don't know if this has happened to you, but sometimes a client will have a Drupal 7 site that was built for them in 2011. They weren't involved in the original build, right? They just got hired on in this agency, and they said, okay, here's our website. They got a new marketing director, and she sits down and she says, oh my gosh, this site is so old looking and everything's clunky, and it is, because it was built 10 years ago or 8 years ago, and it's not a fair comparison, but that person might say, well, I don't want to upgrade to Drupal 8 because I hate Drupal. At my last job, we used WordPress 4.0, and it was so great. So it's not really a fair comparison, but that's something you have to consider, and maybe have that conversation with that person to explain that you can't necessarily compare something built 8 years ago with other contemporary options. And then the fourth reason is probably a pretty common one too, is there's no reason. Like, our site works, everyone's happy with it. We have a number of clients that are in that situation too. So they say, well, why should I bother? And then the answer now is, well, your software is no longer going to be supported in 2 years. But for a lot of them, that may not be the most compelling argument. So that's why you need to consider alternatives or convince them why it's important. I think it's important just from the standpoint of you should be looking to refresh your content in your site periodically, but it's not always the reality for everyone. And while we're on this topic, is anyone here that's using Drupal 7 sites at your work? Is there any reason outside of what I listed here that you got one?
We haven't really had a chance to go through and do a calibration or an inventory of all the modules that we're using, but over time we've kind of I've done like a quick peek test or whatever, and there's definitely a lot of stuff that we're using that isn't available in 8, and so we're either faced with playing chicken with it to see if someone will port something we're using, or we're having to commit to writing it ourselves.
Right, so that's a good one that I did include. So you're relying on some Drupal 7 modules that aren't available. Is it like a whole host of them, or is like?
I don't know, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, you don't know yet.
There are a couple key ones that we know that aren't there, so, and we may be able to get around this by refactoring some of what we're doing, taking some of the business logic out of the Drupal site and putting it in the back end with a microservice bus kind of architecture, but TBD.
Right. And sometimes it's just a matter of getting familiar with Drupal 8, and then you might discover, oh, there's no need for a module like this anymore because you can do it this way. But you don't know that until you had time to research it.
The other thing that's interesting is that 8 also is end of life at the same time, right? Because of the composer issue, or what was there's some feature, like Drupal 8 itself is also sunset, right? At the same time as 7.
That's a good question. I have not heard that. Does anyone else here know anything? Have they heard anything like that?
The 8 and 7 are ending on the same day?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are?
Yeah.
Okay. So.
November 21st,
2021.
2021.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you're either upgraded to, by that point, to 9, which is, again, like a newer version of 8, or you're out of luck. Okay. All right, thanks for sharing that. So I've already tried to make a bit of a case for upgrading. Again, to recap, just 3 to 5 years, consider a redesign, or 2 to 5, depending on who you ask. Of course, those are all arbitrary, but that's just kind of a number I've seen quite a bit, and it resonates with me and my experience. The new features of Drupal 8, which I haven't touched on, but I will briefly later on. Again, this idea of all the activity being in Drupal 8 and 9, that's where people are putting all their energy in developing new features and modules and such. So it's great to be a part of that. And then lastly, of course, is what's your ROI? How much value is your website bringing your organization? And this one I mentioned just because sometimes I've had clients that say, well, this is ridiculous that I would spend another 300 hours or 400 hours to rebuild my website, but they at the same time I'm not throwing shade or anything, but they don't have a problem like running radio ads or TV spots, which could easily be much more expensive. And I wonder to them and to anyone, like, well, I'm guessing that you get as much value out of your website as any other tool in your marketing toolbox, so why not consider that an investment? All right, so budgeting for upgrades or updates. There's no hard or fast rule about this. This is just some suggestions, but it seemed to make sense to me is if you're budgeting for an upgrade for Drupal 7 to 8 site, including that redesign process, how much did you spend on your current site? Look that up, including the work that you've done since you launched. So you might have spent 200 hours on your website initially, but then over time you've done all these site improvements, and it ends up being double that budget over the lifespan of your current site. And then taking that number, and maybe you figure, okay, let's add 25% to that total because we're going to take advantage of some of the new features, some of the change things up for this new Drupal site. And then you have like sort of a baseline number of what you could consider budgeting for that redesign. Or if you build this in-house, how much did you spend on the staff for that site? Use that as the baseline. And again, it'd be nice if it was just a version upgrade, but that is not as easy as you think. So even if you have the most basic of Drupal 7 sites, meaning like you install Drupal 7, you still use Bartik theme, you use the default basic pages and articles, you didn't add any other modules, you don't use path auto or redirects or views or anything. I don't know who that would be, but that's possible. Then yeah, you could upgrade probably that to Drupal 8 in a day because you haven't really changed much of anything. But that isn't the reality for most of us. So, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. I know for us as an agency, having to go to these clients and explain, yes, it's a version upgrade, but it's not just a click of a button. So my wisdom of the day is that upgrading from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 is a pain in the butt. But it gets better once you're there. So revisiting our Doomsday theme again just for a moment. If you're going to do a site upgrade, how are you going to get through it? All right, so why is this so hard? Because if you look even now on the web, if you do a Google search, you'll find people saying, oh, you just use the migrate API and you can migrate your site and it's just, everything's already built for you. It's super easy and fun. And there's the difference between the most basic Drupal 7 site and more complex sites. And most sites, in our experience, have that level of complexity that doesn't migrate so easily. Okay, why again is it so hard? Because as you may or may not know, Drupal 8, complete re-architecture of Drupal using the Symfony framework. It has a different templating system using Twig. It's composer-based. It uses object-oriented programming. All these reasons you see here. There's hundreds of modules that were available for Drupal 7, right? But they're no longer there or they aren't needed because there's a different way to do it. Views are in core, which is great. Everyone loves that. But did you know that means when you migrate, you have to rebuild individually each view that was in your Drupal 7 site, which isn't fun. Media is in core, which is awesome. How are you handling media in your Drupal 7 site? Chances are you could very well be using any number of image fields or video fields or things that aren't really a thing in Drupal 8 anymore. And so you're going to want to rebuild how you manage your media. Layout builder in core, great. You might have been using panels. You might have been using bricks. You might have been using any number of options in Drupal 7. But and you don't have to use layout builder even though it's in core. But if you're going to redesign it in 2019, it's a good place to start. And your features, if you're using features to migrate your site between different server environments, now you use config management. And field collections, that's a fun one. If you're using field collections on any of your content types, those are no longer a thing in Drupal 8. So those all have to be scrubbed and redone. So lots of time sucks ahead. So process to upgrade. Before running any scripts or update commands, you need to plan. That's one of the main takeaways that I have for you today is, other than reasons to do this, is how you should approach a migration. So not only did modules change, but so did best practices. And you don't want to necessarily just try to randomly shove everything from 7 into 8 anyway, even if you could do this automatically, because then you'd just be replicating the patterns and services that you were using before and not taking advantage, of anything that's new or improved in Drupal 8. So you need a different building approach. So let's break this down into just 3 main steps. Step 1, start with a deep analysis of your current site. Look at your Drupal 7 site, look at your content, what's working, what's not. Do a review, make a spreadsheet maybe of all of the modules you have in use, what's the current status of them for Drupal 8. Do you need them? Are you using these or not? How critical are they to your service? How's your site structured? Does the menu still make the sense to you? Does the way content types are organized? What sort of patterns are in place? How are you using media, files, video embeds, layouts? Kind of review, catalog. You can do this all with spreadsheets, probably have meetings with your team to come up with detailed documentation of all the potential problem areas that could occur in moving to Drupal 8. And once you have this comprehensive spreadsheet, you've got your migration plan. So before you've done any coding, you're spending time just really figuring out what's involved in this process. And then from there, you're not clicking migrate even then. You're building a whole new Drupal 8 site first, because unlike some other systems, the way this works is you have to keep your Drupal 7 site, document everything that you need to do here, then go build up this whole new Drupal 8 site first. Then once that's in place, then we'll get to step 3 where you start moving content over. So here, since you're moving to Drupal 8, you're going to have to rebuild your Drupal theme. This is true whether you're moving from Drupal 7 to Backdrop or WordPress, or if you're moving to any different system, the theme isn't going to transfer. So whether you're using a customization of some pre-built theme or whatnot, you're going to have to redo that. And as I mentioned before, you're going to have to rebuild all your views, which if you're running a reasonably complex site, you probably have quite a few views, right? So that's going to take up a lot of your time. So super fun. Rebuilding how you manage layout. There is some automation possible. It just depends on the complexity of your site, whether you can copy anything over from your current site's architecture. And again, as that process, while you're doing the site, why not consider switching to some more modern best practices, such as using the new in-core media and media library, layout builder, configuration management, using Composer, all these things that are part of Drupal 8 that I'm sure were not part of your Drupal 7 life. Okay, so you've done all that. You have your documentation. You've got this framework, this placeholder for your new site. Now you can migrate. And again, this step is a whole talk in itself. There is some initial documentation, some decent documentation on Drupal.org. I'm guessing if you get into it, you'll want to look up some tutorials online at some different sources as well. But you have a step. From step 1, you have your plan. From step 2, you have a site to migrate to. So now you can selectively migrate some of your content via the migrate API and migrate update command. And I say selectively because it's not just a one-to-one dump of all your content. You're going to look at things like, can I migrate all my news, for example, or blog articles, and how's that going to work, and how do I map those fields to Drupal 8 fields? So for most projects, there's still a lot of manual migration into the new build, and really just use common sense, because sometimes for a smaller site, you might figure, well, instead of spending 400 hours migrating this, I'm just going to cut and paste and do it in 100 hours. You know, it's not the best way, but sometimes it makes sense. You don't want to spend 100 hours trying to migrate comments on some blog post that your Drupal 7 site said. Sometimes you just drop that, or you just cut and paste them, because it's just not worth the effort. All right, so again, with all this in mind, you know, do I really need Drupal 8? It's a lot of working costs. Other than the fact that Drupal 7's end of life, is there some other good reasons? And I think there are benefits to upgrading to Drupal 8, which, despite all the pain, we believe Drupal 8 is genuinely a beautiful, powerful CMS that's worth moving to. So some of the great benefits, you know, you get the same Drupal benefits by moving from 7 to 8. You still have that same community, or largely. You still are open source. You still have the thousands and thousands of developers, millions of users, thousands of code contributors, the Drupal community with its strong commitments to accessibility and diversity, familiarity with Drupal. You already know how the system works. Even though it's changed, there are still many things that are the same. And Drupal 8's growing, and you know, you get to be a part of these conferences like DrupalCorn and DrupalCon. You're still part of the family, and I think that is one of the great benefits. But if that isn't enough, and again, some of these you may already all be familiar with, so I don't have to spend much time on it, but just in case, some of the benefits that Drupal 8 comes with: the more in core, views, media, WYSIWYG, text editor, layout builder, and more. And having these in core means future upgrades, you won't have to worry about those modules being updated and moved to future versions of Drupal, because it's just in core, it is required. The improved editorial experience with some inline editing, drag and drop editing with layout builder, improved media management, media library is now in core. That's a new development, stable version. All the data API first platform with Drupal 8 with JSON API in core means easier to talk to other systems than it was in Drupal 7. Accessibility improvements. You can use HTML5 by default in Drupal 8. It's mobile first and responsive by default. Configuration management has been a big boon to anyone who's struggled with the features module in Drupal 7 for many years and all its craziness and complexity. This is definitely a huge step in the right direction. Improved multilingual support and security and performance improvements all come with that upgrade. Also, one of the big features I always try to sell clients on when I'm telling them about the pain of this migration and the cost, is I always emphasize, but remember, future updates are going to be so much easier. So it's not necessarily the winning message when they're looking at what they're going to have to pay to do this, but it is important to me to know that I won't have to go through this with clients after they move to Drupal 8, that to tell them, oh, this is going to be a super expensive process to upgrade to 9, because it's just going to be a regular scheduled release. Just like Drupal 8.7 to 8.8, it's just going to be, okay, now we're moving to 9, run your updates. It may not be a piece of cake. There's always going to be bugs and whatnot, but it's not going to be a major overhaul. And many modules have already been tested and ready to be ported to Drupal 9, so we're already in great shape as far as I can tell and what I've read. All right, and then lastly, Drupal is, you want to be part of the future of Drupal by updating and migrating. And maybe these are some of the reasons, again, that you can use to sell your organization or your client and why to upgrade. There's all these major initiatives that are underway. A lot of them are already to the point of being implemented, but some of them aren't. Things like automatic updates is an exciting initiative that you might have heard of that is coming to Drupal, being able to automatically update the version of Drupal without having to do anything. Things that'll make it easier for people with using Composer with Drupal. They may not be comfortable with the command line, so there's some initiatives to make that part easier. Layout improvements, I've already seen Layout Builder become part of core, same with media. So lots of exciting things going on, and of course Drupal 9 released in just a year is another major development. All right, so knowing all this, our last bit of time here, we looked at the good and bad with Drupal 8, and but we know there are other CMSs, and sometimes what if instead of upgrading a client or organization, or you yourself might say, well, why don't I just move to this other CMS? It's going to be so much easier, and I don't have to deal with all this effort and cost to upgrade to Drupal 8, right? So, or maybe you just say, well, what if I don't do anything at all? Because that is an option, right? You could just say, I'm going to keep running my Drupal 7 site until, I don't know, 2030 or something. Well, first of all, you still have two years left of official Drupal 7 support, so I already covered why that's not necessarily everything in itself, because the momentum and contrib part is not really there as much anymore, but you still have 2 years of security patches, and that's important. Can you budget and plan out for that upgrade or redesign over the course of the next 2 years? It seems a little more realistic than something you have to do tomorrow. But if that's still not the case, and this is true for maybe a lot of clients, maybe a smaller nonprofit or whatnot, they say, I don't have any money. No matter what you say, we got a grant to do this site 8 years ago. We're not getting another one, so what are we going to do? Well, just like with Drupal 6 to 7, there are going to be approved vendors, like MyDropWizard is a good example, that'll offer support for your Drupal site even after that official end of life. So you can go to them for a monthly fee. They'll make sure your site still stays secure even after official support ends. All right, so, or you can migrate to a different CMS. So there's, as you know, dozens or hundreds of options, including other CMSs. You can move to a Jamstack, go to a software as a service. So we can't cover all those, but I just want to briefly look at two prominent options. One is Backdrop, and the other is WordPress. I know there's at least one Backdrop guy here, so he can correct me if I say anything incorrect here. But who hasn't heard of Backdrop? Anyone here? So a few of you. So Backdrop was started as a fork of Drupal 7 when it became clear that Drupal 8 was going to be a much more complex rewrite of Drupal, and there was a core group of Drupal contributors who decided, no, we like Drupal 7, we're just going to work to improve that rather than rip out the system and restart. And so they started Backdrop. It has similar features as your Drupal 7 site, but they've improved them over time. They've improved the user experience from what you've seen from the Drupal 7 site. Many popular modules added to core, and others available as add-ons. So moving to Backdrop CMS, some of the same things you're going to have to do, like rebuild your theme. You're going to want to remove modules that were in Drupal 7 that are no longer supported or needed, like the blog or forum or poll module. You're going to install Backdrop, update settings, and run the updates in your browser, unlike usually with Drupal 8 where you're doing that on the command line. And then you're going to have to test and adjust. There's still some work involved in moving that, but some of the things that are great is that because you're moving Drupal 7 to a port of Drupal 7, things like views, you're not going to have to rebuild all those. Content types in those fields are going to translate as well. So this is my list of pros and cons. It's much less effort to migrate to Backdrop than Drupal 8. It's going to be cheaper. You're going to still be more familiar with the experience because it works a lot like your Drupal 7 site did, with many of the same or improved features like views. And again, in my opinion, the con there is that you're moving to a vastly smaller base of contributors. You might find that okay and want to join them and support them, which is great. But just know that that's a downside for some clients who might worry about finding someone to help support their site. It depends on their needs and who's available, right? And then missing out on some of those new features and initiatives offered by Drupal 8 and 9. which again might not apply to or be important to someone with a small site, but are to larger organizations. And then of course WordPress, I'm not going to say much about it. You all probably have heard of it at least. Looks like we only got a few minutes left. So just if you are doing, you're still going to have to do this whole process of recreating your theme, recreating your content types. You're going to have to recreate your views with whatever plugins are available for WordPress in that regard, and find comparable plugins. There are, interestingly enough, some tools that plugins, I don't know if anyone's tried or used these, but they claim to run the automatic Drupal 7 to WordPress migration for you. Again, I think it's really that case of if it's a simple site, it'll work. And if it's not going to work so great for you. But this comes up because I've had clients say, well, let's just move to WordPress instead of spend all this money with moving to Drupal 8. And I say, well, that's great, but you're still going to have to spend a lot of money to do this effort. You do get a huge base of contributors. You're still open source. There's thousands of plugins. Many of those plugins now have annual fees. You don't know which is the right one to use necessarily. They're not all vetted the same. There's some security concerns. And then the last one, of course, is that you're not Drupal anymore, which is a sad face. So final takeaways. If you haven't moved or not planning to move, I suggest you start planning as soon as possible. You still have 2 years of official Drupal 7. You could consider doing the full redesign instead of just the version upgrade, because the costs are going to be significant enough that you'd want to take advantage of that opportunity to just redo your site to the best it's possible. Start budgeting annually every year for future upgrades, even though we know 8 to 9 and 9 to 10 is going to be easier. And then weigh the alternatives. Maybe one of those other options makes more sense. Staying the course or moving to a different CMS. And that is all I have for you. So thank you very much, and I can take your questions.
When you're talking about the migrate API, that means you're going to be doing some PHP?
Yes.
What was the question? I can help.
He was wondering if you have to use PHP when you're using the migrate API.
Yes. I mean, there is a UI, but that really is what applies to that more simple use case where you've got a really basic site with just a couple content types and not a lot of custom anything. Then there is a UI, but often you're going to be, well, it's not really PHP, although it can be PHP if you have the right custom processors, but you'll be working a lot in YAML.
All right. Any other questions?
I just looked up now, it said that 9 is supposed to be released in June of next year.
Okay.
It's like 6 months away.
So right after DrupalCorn. Yeah.
So do we know materially what the differences are between 8 and 9? I mean, I know the things are going to be deprecated. I'm just staring down the idea of having to like go through one hoops to deal with something that's deprecated and only have to do it again.
Oh, that's a great question.
So I can kind of help answer that one too. I think
Thank you, sir.
There's a site that's not coming to my mind right now, but where they're actively tracking where things are at right now. I think it's up to over 74% coverage right now in terms of all the deprecated code being removed from all Drupal modules across the entire Drupal 8 ecosystem, with the goal, of course, of having that hit 100% by June. And there's all these automated tools now that can like sort of spin through your custom code and say, okay, and you know, the truth is that 90% of the time it's usually a one-line change. Right? Get rid of this one function, change this word. And so I'm highly optimistic that come June, just about everything will be ready for Drupal 9.
And there's like a pre-flight tool you can run like you just.
Yep.
Got it. Okay.
That's available now. Like if you have a Drupal 8 site,
Okay.
you can run right now and see like, okay, what's my site looking like for Drupal 9?
On 8, not like a 7 to 8 pre-flight tool.
I think it's just for 8.
Okay.
Right. So knowing that if you're going to move to 8, there should be a fairly clear path then to go up to 9 from there.
But there's no tool now to take and give you a sense of what your 7 looks like to 8.
I don't think so, no.
There is.
Done, basic.
I'll use about 3 status.
Yeah.
Oh, there. Okay. All right. Well, we're out of time, so thank you very much. If you have any other questions, hit me up.
Are you going to make the presentation available?
Of course. Yep. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.